Welcome to MarshWatch Session 2. Today we're going to be covering Intro to Bird ID as well as the first ID session. Oh, better get started, eh? There. So before we get started with tonight's program, I'd just like to say that I'm joining you today from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory that encompasses the traditional territory of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. For this evening's program, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap for what MarshWatch is. I think we might have a few new folks joining us. And then we're going to do a little bit of an overview of beginner bird ID. This is just going to be a quick run through of some of the basics. If you're interested in a more thorough beginner bird ID, intro thing, I do have a beginner bird ID program linked on that MarshWatch webpage, which I will link to in the comments at the end of the session tonight. Actually, you know what? I can put that in there right now for anyone who wants to make note. Oh, and I sent it to just the host and panelists. Here we go. I'm learning too. Okay, then we're going to get into tonight's bird ID. We've got 8 species of birds and 2 species of frog, and then I'll show my contact information, after which I will stop the recording, and then we can get into a little bit of quizzing and any discussions, any questions that you might have. So join me for the program. So for those of you who weren't here last week, my name is Leanne Lachimore, and I really honestly do love wetlands. I've been fortunate enough to be working in wetlands for a long time, not every year, but I do have 6 summers under my belt of slogging through wetlands and enjoying almost every minute of it. It's a really special place to me. They're super dynamic habitats, and I really do love them. I love the smells, I love the sights, I love the sounds, and hopefully through this series you're going to gain a little bit of that passion too if you don't already have it. You might, because you're tuning into a wetland program, but I think they're pretty fascinating places. MarshWatch as a whole is a pilot program that we're developing this year, and it's aimed at teaching birds and amphibians by sight and sound, and mostly getting at wetland appreciation as well. We'll have weekly webinars, quizzes both during the webinar and posted online. I'm going to do some guided walks for sure in Saskatoon and Brandon. And the mini goal of this project is to get you feeling confident to submit a checklist from a wetland of your choosing sometime in July. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I like to have a mini goal that we're working towards. So if you want to do that, we'll talk about doing that kind of midway through the program once we get a bit of bird ID under our belt. And if you're super duper interested in wetlands, the more formal marsh monitoring program is going to be returning to the prairies in 2024. So I'm really excited about that. And maybe if you're feeling confident, you might want to join that too. For the ID sessions, we're going to cover a few birds, we're going to cover a few amphibians, we'll do ID by both sight and sound, do a review quiz, and then we'll have that discussion. And we're going to cover a bunch of species, and this doesn't actually encompass everything that you're even likely to encounter in a wetland in the summer. I had to, make some decisions. Otherwise, this would have been a multi-month webinar series. So this is kind of the core species that you're likely to encounter during the summer period, during that breeding season. So these are going to be the birds that are really in the wetland, using it extensively or nesting in it. There's going to be species on the spring and fall migrations, which are going to transit through, and they're doing that right now, that we're not going to be covering. Maybe next year I'll do a similar MarshWatch, but we'll focus a bit more on the shoulder season species. But for now, we're going to be teaching those core ones that are going to occur kind of during that nesting period in the summertime, that are going to stick around, because some of them are only here for a few days at a time. And should we need to cancel, I'm going to send out an email as soon as possible, and I will reschedule the webinars for the following Friday at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, so 8 p.m. in Manitoba. And there will be a reminder email sent out an hour before that webinar, so you will still get a notification that a webinar is going to be starting. So just in case we need to cancel, I do get some pretty nasty migraines, which I don't get to control when they strike. Okay. So let's move on to that bird identification for beginners piece. There's 2 pieces of equipment that I always recommend people have with them when they're going out bird watching. And the first is a pair of binoculars. And if you've never used a pair of binoculars, one of the big keys is if you're wearing glasses, those eye cups need to be down. And if you're not wearing eyeglasses, those eye cups need to be up. That'll keep the binoculars at the correct distance away from your face, avoiding tunnel vision and such. And that center wheel is your focus wheel. But I get the feeling that most here have used binoculars before. But to keep in mind, when you're trying to spot a bird, use your eyes and ears first to locate the bird or get, close to the general area. Then you want to bring those binoculars up and, eventually lock in on that bird. But if you're just looking around willy-nilly, that can help sometimes, but it's really difficult to, lock onto a specific bird. So use your eyes and ears first, try to figure out where that bird is, and then bring your binoculars up to it. The other important piece is reference material, and I am a big proponent of paper field guides, especially for beginner birders. At this point, I don't always bring mine out, but if you're just getting started with learning your birds, a paper guide is actually going to be super, super helpful, because as you're flipping through it, as you're trying to find the bird that you're seeing, you're not going to notice it, but your brain is actually learning kind of in the background. As you're flipping through, you're just seeing those flashes of images of birds. And those flashes of images, as you're flipping through the pages, those actually start to get stuck in your head. And when you see a bird, you might say, hey, I remember seeing something similar to that in my bird guide. And I really find that you lose that with the digital guides. So there's all kinds of field guides and reference books. There's painted field guides. There's photographic ones that have gotten quite good in the last decade, as digital photography has gotten a lot better. They used to be terrible. There's also regional field guides. And if you are in Saskatchewan, you might think that the best field guide to get is the Western field guide. However, because Saskatchewan's kind of, in terms of bird distribution, we're pretty centrally located. We actually do a better job of being covered by some of the Eastern guides, because we're east of the Rockies, and that's a big bird division. So always check the range map for those Eastern versus Western guides, because Saskatchewan especially sometimes falls into strange places. Manitoba is pretty much always covered in the east. Alberta is going to be a bit more western, because you do have a fair bit of Rocky Mountain species that occur there, but Saskatchewan is kind of that right tug of war in the middle. And then, of course, there's your at-home coffee table books and reference materials. But there are a lot of smartphone apps that are super useful and super helpful. Two guides that I quite enjoy, mostly the Sibley Birds of North America. That's about $20, and it's not cheap, but I also look at it as, buying another field guide. So it's a really good app. It's very slick. Another free one is the Audubon Bird Guide. And one that's really, been improving a fair bit and is developing a lot in the last couple of years is Merlin, and that's from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's free. It also, as well as being a guide, it has an integrated system where, it helps you ID the bird. So it can ask you a series of questions about what, when, and where you saw a bird, but it can also now do audio recognition. However, I want to emphasize this important caveat. Those ID functions, any of them, whether you're picking through various things about a bird, or especially if you have the birdsong recorder going and it's telling you what you're hearing, those IDs are just a suggestion. The technology is good, but it is by no means perfect. And I work a lot with audio recordings of birds, and the technology isn't there to just say, let's run a program over it and it'll tell us everything that is on there without any errors. It is by no means there. So one of the things when you're using those tools, whether it's Google Lens or anything like that, you must determine if the suggestion actually matches what you saw. So don't just take it as Merlin told me this, therefore this is what I saw. You always have to do that work to double check. They're an ID aid. They're not the word. So that's just a distinction that I'd like to drive home, because I see this increasingly in a lot of birding forums, and people come up to you and say, hey, Merlin told me this. It's like, Yes, Merlin suggested this, and that's not quite right. So bear in mind, useful tools, really interesting, but you still have to do a little bit of work yourself. Okay, there's a few things that you want to take into consideration when you are observing a bird or any object out in the world for that matter. And that comes down to shape, size, context, coloration, and especially with birds and amphibians, sound. There's lots of objects in the world, and I've never seen every coffee mug there is, but based on the size, the shape, and the context, I can identify coffee mugs regardless of their coloration. So just keep that in mind. The shape, size, and context are really important pieces, as well as sound and coloration. And sometimes, especially in a wetland, shape might be all that you have. The bird might be horribly backlit. The lighting might be terrible for a variety of other reasons. But even just a silhouette, the shape of the bird can tell you a lot. All of these birds have a long bill, but one of them is a long straight bill. One of them is very, very fine and slightly curved. Another one is big and wedge shaped. So just taking a look at the shape of those birds can lead you to an identification. On the left, we have a Wilson snipe. In the center, we have an American avocet. And on the right-hand side, you probably guessed, that is your great blue heron. So shape can teach you a lot. However, posture and feather position can dramatically change the way a bird looks, and this is especially true in photos. I'm sure we've all had a photo taken of us that you wonder, oh, that's not how I normally look. I do not like that face that I'm making. It's the same with birds. You catch them at an awkward moment and they can look very, very different. So for this great blue heron, for example, they do have a long neck that is oftentimes extended, but they can scrunch up and make it look like they don't really have much of a neck. A robin can fluff up its feathers and keep itself warm and turn into a very spherical blob-looking bird. That's a pretty dramatic change right there. And birds that have crests can also raise or lower them. So the blue jay usually has a nice prominent crest, but depending on what it's trying to signal, what the bird is up to, it may lower that crest. It has that ability to move its body feathers. That helps in thermoregulation, signaling to other birds, and sometimes they just, I presume, feel like it. So next up, size. Size is a bit of a tricky one because it can be really difficult to assess size if you don't have anything around the bird. So one thing to do, and this is from Cornell's Merlin app, is compare to birds that you know. So is this bird that you're seeing roughly sparrow size, roughly robin size, roughly crow size? Use markers of common familiar birds. Does a bird look teeny tiny? Does it look quite large? And size can be very deceptive. I once hiked up a mountain and I hadn't noticed that the trees were getting increasingly smaller as I was going up. I just wasn't doing that sort of, mental math. And near the top of the mountain, I was just blown away. There was what looked like this very large kind of robin-sized bird that was beautifully, brightly, boldly colored. And I just, I was like, wow, what is that? I must be seeing something very unique. And then I realized that it was actually a very small warbler, but the trees had gotten very small without my noticing. And so it looked relatively large at the top of this tiny tree. So just keep in mind, size can definitely play tricks on you. If you're out on the prairies and the bird happens to be perched on a fence post, use that to your advantage. We do have a lot of fence posts out here. So if you see a bird perched on a fence post, you can get a rough idea for it. Is this a big bird? Is this a small bird? Is this a medium-sized bird? So compare to nearby objects. The context that you see a bird in can give you a lot of clues. So a range map is going to be really useful for letting you know roughly where and when you might expect a bird. So here's the distribution map for the white-throated sparrow. And in that kind of orangey color, we've got its rough breeding range. Now, if you happen to be like on the outside of that a little bit and you see that bird, for sure, this is just a representation for where they're most likely to be. Of course, they can be found outside of those places because birds do have wings and they have been known to use them, as Martin Stoffel likes to say. But this is just going to give you a rough idea for when and where you're likely to see a species. if you're looking through your field guide and you go, ooh, I think it might be this bird, and you look at the range map and you go, oh, that's an East Coast species and I'm on the West Coast, it's probably not that one. So use that to your advantage, as well as the habitat. There's going to be different birds found in this boulder field versus this southern slough. So just, keep in mind where you are and the context that you're in. Feeding behavior can also be a really interesting clue, especially for ducks, and this is going to be really useful for wetland bird ID. Ducks can be divided into two categories. We've got your dabblers and you've got your divers. The dabblers are the ones that tip up or feed at the surface. These guys are good at walking. They've got their legs kind of centrally located on their body. So these are your mallards, your northern shoveler, your gadwall, your pintail. And these guys can fly from a standstill. They can take off, shoot practically straight up from the water. Or if you're like me, if you've ever walked around at a pasture at night and you happen to come across a nesting, say, mallard hen that just explodes up from right in front of your feet and you give yourself a mini heart attack, divers can't do that. Divers, they feed by diving below the surface, and they're really built for a life in the air as well as underwater. They're really poor at walking on land because their legs are quite a fair bit farther on their body, farther back on their body. So that really helps them with propulsion and swimming, but it makes them very bad at walking. So these aren't birds that you're going to see wandering around a pea field eating waste grain. And they have kind of a bit reduced wing load, so they have a little bit smaller and narrower wings, which means they don't actually have the wing power to shoot straight up. So they need a bit of a runway to fly. So you'll often see these birds flapping and kind of running and trying to get started in their flight along the water. So there's a few physiological differences that are helpful. So if you're out there looking at a pond, and I've done this lots, say the birds are way too far away, you can't see them, the lighting is horrible, but you see a bunch of mostly diving birds, you go, oh, okay, these are mostly diving ducks. Cool, I've at least narrowed it down to that, because it's not always possible to get to a confident identification. Sometimes it's literally just not possible. They're too far. The lighting isn't good. You didn't see them for long enough. And I like to sometimes be able just to put them into a bin if I can. So, oh, okay, we have some dabblers out here. Further in the middle, we've got some divers. So that's just an interesting context piece that you can use, especially for wetland birds. And of course, coloration comes into play. And I do this one last because I get an awful lot of phone calls from folks saying, hey, I have myself a brown bird. Can you help me? I want to know what it is. But they haven't, made any effort to look at the size, the shape. They can't tell me anything else about the bird. I do my best to help them. But, if you pay attention to other parts of the bird, what kind of bill does it have? What's the shape of it? You can, get to an ID more readily. So if you're looking at colors and patterns, you want to just get a sense for the overall. So, is it brown and streaky like the female red-winged blackbird, or is it kind of uniform? Got that, base black that the red-winged blackbird is with that, it's got a bright shoulder patch, but overall it's a pretty black bird otherwise. So just get a sense for that overall. Brown and streaky, is it black and white overall? That can be useful as a first impression to make for color. The wing is also a really important place to look at, especially for ducks, especially for the dabbling ducks. They often have a really brightly colored patch called the speculum on their wing, and this is really helpful in identifying females that are otherwise fairly nondescript and brownish. But otherwise, birds might have wing bars, and even the lack of a feature, like on this mountain bluebird, just a plain wing is also a feature to note. Note that there can be differences between the sexes, so it's called sexual dimorphism. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the mallard, we've got the drake, and we've got the hen. That's how ducks are usually denoted for sex. And on the right-hand side, we have the house bird. We've got the male on top and the female on bottom here. And both of those birds look a fair bit different from one another, but they are the same species. So boys and girls can look different, but they can also look identical in a lot of species. And we'll have examples of both today. Otherwise, there is some seasonal variation. There's breeding plumage and non-breeding plumage for a lot of passerine birds. Especially, what's interesting is for the ducks, a lot of males, well, all the males will go through an eclipse plumage. And so when they're molting their flight feathers, they're actually quite vulnerable. They can't fly, they can't get away. And during this time, they'll take the opportunity to molt all of their body feathers, and they'll actually take on the more mottled and subdued appearance of the females. So just note that this kind of happens in, mid to late summer. A lot of the males will seem to disappear, but they don't actually disappear. They're just going through their eclipse plumage. And this is, again, where that wing patch is really helpful to key in on. So that's just an example of the seasonal variation that can occur in coloration. And last but not least, sound. Sound is a really interesting one. So birds use sound in a couple of different ways, and the one that might be obvious is to attract a mate. So a lot of birds are going to be singing and advertising, saying, hey ladies, check out my territory, listen to my beautiful song. Some birds are mimics, and they'll actually, try to get the biggest song repertoire that they can to impress the ladies. Others just kind of do what the species does, but they're belting their hearts out. On the other hand, they do it for another reason, and that's for territory defense. So a lot of birds are also going to be saying, like, hey Bob, stay away, this is my territory, I don't want to fight, because most animals are going to actually avoid confrontation as much as they can. So birds do this by singing, by signaling that, this territory is occupied, it's mine, don't step over that imaginary line or there might be trouble. So that's another interesting bit of sound. But if you learn what the birds are saying, they'll actually be telling you their name if you're able to listen closely enough. And this is really helpful because, unlike this collage that I've put together, most of what you're going to be encountering when you're birding in a wetland or otherwise is going to be this. You're just going to be hearing those bird sounds from way off in the distance somewhere, some hidden bird that you'll potentially not see, but if you know the sound that it makes, it's essentially telling you its name. And I remember when I first started working in, the biology field, I was fresh out of school and I was really, starting to learn my birds. And I just thought I had magic powers. I was walking through a little, forested area, and I could tell what all the bird sounds were around me. I didn't see a single bird, but I knew that there was a blue jay, there was a rose-breasted grosbeak, there was a robin, and I just thought that was one of the coolest superpowers that you could ever acquire. And it's not that difficult to get. So hopefully, as we go through the species, you too will gain some of these superpowers. It's a lot of fun. Okay, so let's get on to the birds and frogs that we're going to encounter today. We're going to go nice and slow and pretty easy for the first ones. We'll do the Canada goose, the mallard, the northern shoveler, the yellow-headed blackbird, red-winged blackbird, Sora, and the boreal chorus frog and the wood frog. Without further ado, I don't know that this bird needs too much introduction. It's going to be pretty well known to everyone. This is the Canada goose. It is a large goose, especially folks here on the prairies. We see a fair number of other Arctic nesting geese, and this is definitely the biggest one. So both sexes look similar. The males are often a little bit larger than the females, but otherwise, visually, the birds look pretty much the same. They've got a black-headed neck and that neat little white chin strap. They've got a brown body overall, a little black tail on it, and a white rear. You'll often see some individuals that have a bit of a white forehead patch as well, and that's just part of the normal variation in Canada goose. And some will show other patches of white, and that's called leucism, and that's just a pigmentation issue, and this can occur in a number of species. But by and large, this is what your Canada goose looks like, and you will find these, as you may know, pretty much everywhere that there is open water and grazing opportunity. You'll find them in wetlands, in lakes, in rivers, in urban settings, near water, or sometimes a ways out from water. Especially if you are tuning in from Regina, you will know that there are a lot of Canada geese in Wascana Park. It's kind of perfect for them. There's lovely grazing, and there's water right nearby. They just love it. And the sound, I'm sure, is familiar to most. They do a honk. So that's just a couple of them, but oftentimes, especially on migration, you will hear a lot of geese going at one time. This is what a lot of geese sound like. And I think that's pretty familiar to most. So quite the loud honking. What do they eat? Well, as I mentioned before, they are a grazer. They'll eat grasses, sedges, other plants, berries and seeds, and agricultural grains a lot on the wintering grounds. But like most grazers, if they happen to come across a snail or some small insect, they're going to take that protein along with them. But what they're primarily after is plant matter, and folks have seen those bright green turds on parks, I'm sure. They're essentially, you know, the cows of the bird world. They just yum 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 eat, and they run it through their system pretty quickly. It's pretty nice free fertilizer. They have precocial young, meaning that when their young hatch, they are fluffy and ready to go. So this includes geese and ducks have lovely precocial young, cute little fluff balls. I do love them. They do have a bit of an attitude, this is true, but I just think they're lovely birds. And they're also a heavily banded species. And when we band birds, we're doing that for a few reasons. You can't just go and band birds because you want to catch them. You think holding birds is cool for no reason. You know, every banding project is vetted. The people doing the banding are well trained. And we do this to learn about population size, rates of survival. This is really important in hunted species like the Canada goose. There's complicated math formulas that help you determine, you know, how many birds were banded, how many birds were recovered, and what some of the survival rate is. It helps us learn about migratory pathways. So especially for hunted species, because they are harvested, we actually get a really high rate of return on bands compared to small birds. So this lets us know, you know, where birds are coming, where they're going. We can also get interesting longevity records. The oldest Canada goose was 33 years old. And this is a wild bird, which is pretty amazing. You know, that's older than a lot of people. So it's also used for monitoring endangered species and, like I said, for hunting regulations. And if you do happen to be in Regina, you've probably seen a fair number of banded Canada geese. And they were banded from 2009 to 2015, primarily with the metal band, and that's the standard type of band that is put on all birds. However, if you're doing a bit more of a, you know, resighting study, you can also additionally add on color bands, and these were added on from 2010 to 2015 in Wascana Park, and this makes them really easily resightable. So if you do see one of these birds, report it. You know, not necessarily in Wascana. If you ever come across a banded bird and you're able to get that band number, say, you know, it was unfortunately a deceased bird, or if you're a hunter, if you harvested a banded bird, or if you happen to get fantastic shots and were able to, you know, get enough of the band number for a complete number, please do report that. It really does help research. So there's a toll-free line, 1-800-327-BAND, or you can go to reportband.gov, and it's a North American-wide agency. The bird banding office is run out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's not necessarily a Canadian place to report them to. It's just the North American wide place to report them to. So that's reportband.gov. They make it pretty easy, and at least they used to. They can send you a little certificate, which is kind of cool, because I found a neat band, and I can tell you about that in our discussion period if you're interested. Here's the range of the Canada goose. So we're going to be finding this pretty much across Canada, with the exception of some places in kind of that like shield area of Ontario and Quebec, as well as missing from a little bit of the Gaspé and some parts of New Brunswick. But yeah, fairly ubiquitous, the Canada goose. Next up, we've got another fairly ubiquitous species, and this is the mallard. And it is just called mallard, not mallard duck. And mallard doesn't mean boy. Mallard is just the species name. And it's a pretty large dabbling duck. You're going to see this next to other species, and it's going to look fairly large. The male is going to be called the drake, and this is, like I said earlier, all male ducks are referred to as drakes. So the drake has a lovely iridescent green head. And something to note about iridescent colors, it's going to change the way it looks depending on how the light is striking it and how it's getting to your own eyeball. So this head can look quite black if seen in the wrong light, and I have some photos later on where it just looks like quite a dark head. But that green is reflected off the feather shafts to your eyes, so it's not the green wavelength isn't absorbed; it's being reflected right back at you. But it really depends on the angle because it's a structural color. So they've got that iridescent shiny green head. They've got a white collar around their neck in between the green and the chestnut breast. And that white collar stands out pretty prominently. White is a really good color to pay attention to on ducks because it's reflecting back all wavelengths. It actually shows up pretty good even in poor light conditions. So noting where the white is on a duck can actually be really helpful for low light conditions. It's got a nice white little collar, a bright yellow bill, that kind of chestnutty brown breast, curly tail feathers. They do have these most of the time, but not always, and they're pretty grayish flanks. They're not white. It's not that bright white of the, that tip of that tail or the collar, but definitely kind of plain gray flanks. The speculum is iridescent blue, bordered with black and white in both sexes. And that's pretty useful, especially for the hen, because she shows off her speculum a fair bit. And this is going to have a pretty standard quack, quack, quack. Trouble with this is that there are lots of female ducks that also do a fair bit of quacking, so it's not as diagnostic as you would like it to be, but it can be a good clue. So let's listen to the mallard quacking. Kind of sounds like your stereotypical. This almost sounds like the iPhone duck ring. It's pretty much that. So if you ever wondered what that was, it's probably a mallard. And you will find mallards pretty much in any wet habitat. Even in some neighborhoods that are a fair bit away from water. I have a friend who lives in the neighborhood, and he's got a pair of mallards that are hanging out in his yard. So they will, nest a fair ways away from a body of water and walk their little kiddos along. But, any wet habitat, you might see a mallard. And especially here on the prairies, if the ditch is wet, there's probably going to be a mallard in it. The hen, on the other hand, is quite mottled brown, and this is a feature of the dabbling ducks. Because they nest away from the wetland, they actually nest on land, their feather pattern is, trying to mimic grass and things. So she wants to stay hidden. She does not want to be flashy and attract any attention to herself, especially when she's on her nest. So she looks pretty drab and pretty plain. So a kind of mottled brown overall. And the bill is going to be orange with a dark center, and that can be a little bit speckly, or it can be quite a dark saddle. But that kind of orange with that darkish center is going to be very helpful for identifying your hen mallard. And she's got a fine dark line through the eye, and we'll compare that with the northern shoveler, who's kind of more plain faced. It's not super prominent necessarily on the mallard that you might be thinking for if you're used to other species, but there is a bit of a dark eye line there. And that speculum is, again, still blue and bordered with black and white. Because it is iridescent, sometimes depending on the light, it actually looks black. So like in this photo down here, that speculum patch, it just looks quite dark, but it's bordered above and below with those bright white markings. And you can even see it in this top photo here. You can just make it out. So that is a really helpful clue, especially on the mallard, that for whatever reason, you tend to see that speculum a little bit more than you do in other species. At least that's what I've run into. The diet of the mallard, they're a surface feeder. They're that dabbler, so they're often going to be the ones that you see tipping up. You'll see their little bums in the air and, kind of burying their face in the water and snacking on stuff. What are they after? Well, they're a pretty big generalist. They're omnivores. They'll eat everything from insect larvae, snails, freshwater shrimp to seeds, aquatic vegetation, and especially in the fall, you'll find them on agricultural crops. So you'll often see them in pea fields here on the prairies, but they'll also go after wheat and barley as well. So they have a pretty broad diet. They'll pretty much eat whatever it is they can get their little bills on. And that bottom photo there is a little duckling going after a midge. We talked about this in our last webinar, those midge hatches that, they kind of look like mosquitoes, but they don't bite, but they just get all over the place. They might be annoying, but they're super important food for all kinds of species, and even, species that you might not think would go after a little fly. This little duckling is going to be feasting on midges, amongst other things. And interestingly, the mallard is one of two ancestors of pretty much all domestic duck species. The other is the Muscovy duck. So if you ever, wondered how we got all of those domestic duck species, a lot of those come from the mallard. And you might not know this, but there's a lot of ducks that actually have a circumpolar distribution. The mallard is found in so much of the northern hemisphere. It's kind of incredible. I'm always blown away by this because, most of our field guides were looking at the North American context, which absolutely makes sense. This is, where we're birding. But if you take a step back, sometimes it is pretty incredible to see the full range of the species. So the mallard is going to be found, across Canada, Alaska, across Russia, Europe, all over the place. It's pretty neat to look at some of these duck range maps, and I always get blown away by this. And I always wonder, like, what the heck is going on with, northern Quebec and Labrador? I don't know why there are no mallards there. That's interesting to me. The other duck that you might see that has a green head is the northern shoveler. It's a medium-sized dabbler. It's not going to be as large as the mallard. And the defining feature of the northern shoveler is this large shovel-shaped bill. It really looks like somebody put a comical duck bill on, a duck's face. It is oversized. It's kind of goofy looking. The drake is actually quite spectacular looking, in my opinion. He's got a dark iridescent green head. It's usually a bit darker in its green than the mallard is. But the thing that really stands out, especially at a distance, is that rusty patch on bright white flanks. And you can't even tell that it's rusty, at a large distance, but you can see that dark patch on this bright white side of this bird. And that is just a dead giveaway for northern shoveler at a distance, because the bird might be sleeping, it might have its bill tucked, it might be feeding, might be so far away that even that great honking bill can't really be discerned super well. But that flank, that side, that bright white with the rusty patch on it is a super valuable tool for identifying this bird. The bill, in all of its massiveness, is quite black in the drake. And they also have a powdery blue wing patch above the speculum. The blue-winged teal will also have this, and the cinnamon teal, I believe, has the blue patch too. See, I don't know everything, but I do know a lot. The speculum is green, and it's bordered with white on top in both sexes. So that's another helpful little feature. And I really like the sound that the northern shoveler drake makes. It's kind of like a suk 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 noise, and we'll listen to it here. So that's a pretty distinctive call. That suk 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 suk. It's the sort of thing that you're standing in a wetland and you'll hear that, coming in behind you, and sure enough, you look and you've got your northern shoveler. So it is still useful to know some of the duck noises. The hen, on the other hand, she looks a fair bit different. She is very, very drab, very, very plain. When we looked at that mallard, she had an eye stripe. There isn't really an eye stripe at all in the northern shoveler hen. She's just kind of plain mottled brown overall, but she's got this orange bill, and it's going to be lacking that kind of darker, like much darker center. It has a bit of an olive center, but not quite as, dark as what you're going to see in the mallard, or as defined. And it's just still a great big honking bill. You can even see in the bottom left here, even the ducklings look like they have an absurd large bill stuck to their face. They're just so cute. So that great big bill for the hen is really going to be your giveaway. She does have that, green speculum with the white border on top, but for whatever reason, I find that they keep those feathers tucked up more than the mallards do. So it can be useful if you happen to see it and she's alone, and for whatever reason you haven't picked up on the great big bill. That can be a useful field mark, but it's less seen than it is on the mallard. And again, this is another species that if you have some water, you are likely to have a northern shoveler in it. Similarly, ditch has water, will have northern shoveler, but wetlands of any size, really. And what do these guys eat? They're a surface feeder, so they're also a dabbler, but they have a really interesting filter feeding bill, and they're basically like, the little baleen whales of the marshland. You can see those little teeth, those lamellae on the edge of the bill there on that hen. And mostly they're filtering out small swimming invertebrates, so that's going to be insects, larvae, daphnia, other crustaceans, and they'll also eat seeds and plant remains. If you are a hunter, you might note that the northern shoveler doesn't taste terribly good. It's likely due to all of those insects that it is eating, as opposed to focusing on plant material. So yeah, surface filter feeding mostly for the northern shoveler. And again, this is another one with a circumpolar distribution. In North America, it's more of a central western species. We don't see them so often in Ontario and Quebec, but out here on the prairies, Manitoba westward, we definitely have lots of northern shovelers. So if you want to come learn your ducks, if you don't live on the prairies, this is the best place in the world to do it. So let's compare those ducks with green heads. We've got the mallard and the shoveler. The mallard is going to have a bright yellow bill, and it's going to be regular duck-sized. In the northern shoveler, it's going to be black, spatulate, and large. It is, comically large and, shovel-shaped. The body color is going to be gray with a chestnut breast, and we also do have that white little collar. And the body color on the northern shoveler, again, that bright white body with rusty flanks on the side. You can really see that. If you just want to give a quick listen to the quacking of the mallard. Oops. Versus the suk suk, suk suk of the northern shoveler. Oh, why is that going? Oh, hang on here. Okay. So that suk suk, suk suk, suk suk noise. And comparing those hens side by side, the bill is going to be orange with a dark center. In this one, it's a bit splotchy. And the speculum is going to be blue with a white border both above and below. And on the northern shoveler, that bill is very large, spatulate, orange and olive, and the speculum is going to be green with a white border above. Next up, we have the ubiquitous red-wing blackbird. This is a medium-sized blackbird, and like all blackbirds, it's going to have a kind of cone-shaped pointy bill. So in this case, it is black. Pardon me. The male is black all over. He was our example earlier with that beautiful red and yellow shoulder patch. Now, depending on the situation, those can be either fluffed up and made really prominent. And, he's going to be doing this when he's signaling his territory, when he's, trying to impress the ladies, he's going to have those shoulder pads fluffed up and looking great. or they can be hidden. So if he's trying not to signal, he's like, maybe he's just trying to pass through somebody else's territory, they do have the ability to hide those a little bit. So sometimes they can hide them so much that you only see a sliver of the yellow. And that's normal. They can hide those and they can expose those a little bit. They don't usually hide the whole thing, but they do hide a little bit. And the song is probably going to be familiar to most people if you spend any time around wetlands. They sing a conqueree, conqueree. Another common sound that they make is a very loud descending seep. I'm doing a terrible imitation. I'll just play the song, but you hear it a fair bit in wetlands, and that one throws people off. That's your conqueree. And that's the C, the loud C noise. That one might be a little bit loud, but you get the idea. So they often will do that. And blackbirds make a lot of different noises in general, lots of clucks, lots of chink noises. The female does a rattle call, which I wasn't able to get a good crack of in time for running this presentation, but the female is going to do a bit of a rattle call. So if you spend time in wetlands, just hang out and try to listen to all the different sounds that the red-winged blackbirds make, and it's quite incredible. The female, on the other hand, looks a fair bit different than the male. She is really going to be brown, streaky overall. Again, she was our example earlier. One thing to clue in on, she's got a paler kind of stripe, a little bit of an eyebrow thing going. So that pale stripe can be helpful in identifying her. She's going to be, medium sized, not going to be a little sparrow. That black cone-shaped bill is a giveaway. If you're wondering, gosh, is this a sparrow? Sparrows have, shorter, seed-eating, crunching bills, but the large, kind of pointy cone-shaped bill is unique to blackbirds. So take a look at that bill shape, and that can be helpful if you're a little bit confused. You're going, oh goodness, I have a streaky bird. Don't panic, you can do this. Some of the older females will develop a bit of a reddish patch on their shoulder. You can sort of see it in the bottom left-hand photo here where she's developing a little bit of that reddish patch, and it just seems like older females will develop that coloration. So coarsely streaked brown, pale eyebrow, and then they also have a bit of that orange wash at the base of the bill. And these birds are another one that's ubiquitous in any sort of wet, brushy, marshy habitat. So, they can be quite at home in a tree near a lake, or they can be right in the middle of a wetland. They're quite adaptable. They do like to be around water, though. And they've got a distribution that pretty much, if you were tuning in today from somewhere in Canada, you are likely to encounter a red-winged blackbird. So that makes it a nice one for everybody to be able to see. One of the more Western specialties is the yellow-headed blackbird. And I remember the first time that I took the train out to Saskatchewan. I grew up in Montreal, and I was just over the moon when I saw my first yellow-headed blackbird. That's why I took the train. I wanted to see the change in habitat, and the little old lady who was my traveling companion in the train car thought I was crazy. But I just love these yellow-headed blackbirds. It is such a rich golden yellow on those males, the black body, just outstanding yellow. If you haven't appreciated one in a while, I suggest you go and appreciate one, even if you've seen them 1,000 times. They're going to be similar in size and shape to the red-winged blackbird, but they're strikingly different. They have a black cone-shaped bill as well. It's a little bit less aggressively pointy, I think, than the red-winged blackbird. But the male has that black body, yellow head and breast. It's got a little bit of a black Zorro mask on there, and he's got a white wing patch, which is actually quite visible, especially when the bird is flying. Get that little flash of white. They don't make the most musical, melodious of sounds. One of them is called a musical, and I definitely put that in quotations, their song, with, it's got some intro notes and some buzzes, and I describe that as kind of going beep, boop, wah, wah. And they have a snarl song, which is just an extended chainsaw, like buzzy wah, portion. So let's take a listen as opposed to my surely terrible descriptions or imitations. So that last one was the snarl. Wah. That's the kind of musical song that beep boop wah wah. I'll just play that again. So it's quite the snarly song. It is definitely not a melodious sound. The females are brownish overall, and they have a reduced amount of yellow, but they also still have that black mask. These guys are common in deep wetlands where there's cattails and bulrush, and they're actually kind of loosely colonial. You'll always see them in a group. The red-winged blackbirds will often nest amongst each other as well, but red-winged blackbirds, you won't be finding just, the odd male and female pair out on their own. They're going to be loosely colonial in a group as they nest. And again, that kind of more western central distribution. You can get them on the edges of the Great Lakes, but generally they're kind of a hallmark of western wetlands. Okay, see, this is going a little bit long, so I'll adjust for future ones. We did do the beginner stuff on the front end. So next up, we have one of my favorite birds. This is the Sora. It's a small rail, and you know that expression, thin as a rail? Well, it's actually referring to rails as birds. These guys are laterally compressed because they can weave in and through dense vegetation. They look pretty broad, but head on, they're actually quite narrow. Both sexes are going to be identical in this species. They have a bright yellow pointed little bill. They have an upturned little tail, which is white below, and that white kind of stands out. They're mottled brown above, and they've got a blue-gray body, and they have a nice little black mask and throat. You're going to find the Sora, especially in the West and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You're going to find these in most wetlands that have emergent vegetation. And they're very vocal. They're very territorial, to the point where if you get out of a wetland and you accidentally slam your car door too loud, I have had that set off Soras. So they're quite aggressive, and there's two pretty common calls that you'll hear them make. The one is called the whinny, and that kind of sounds like a horse's whinny. And that trailing part can go on for a long time, or it can be short. So again, that little whinny. And they also do this sound called a purr-weep, and you'll hear them do that a fair bit as well. Purr-weep, purr-weep. It's really neat when you get, a whole bunch of them going. So you're at a really big wetland, especially if you go at night. You can hear tons of these guys going at the same time, and it's just incredible. I do love them. For food, they're a picker. They'll walk around and pick little bits of things. They'll eat aquatic plant seeds, duckweed and pondweed. They'll also eat aquatic invertebrates, insect larvae, insect adults, lots of snails, and they do lay a whole bunch of eggs. I actually found this nest while doing some wetland surveys, and I think these two eggs here were laid by other Soras, or even potentially a Virginia rail. Some birds will just don't put all your eggs in one basket sort of thing. Well, some of these birds took that quite literally, and they will go around and lay eggs in the nests of either sometimes conspecific, so the same species, or a related species. Ducks are notorious for doing this, so I suspect that's what was going on in this rather large clutch of eggs. Soras are, distributed kind of widely across North America. I didn't encounter them so much when I was doing some marsh bird surveys on the Great Lakes. They're definitely a fair bit more abundant out here on the prairies, I find. So that's just, my own personal observation of where I've seen more or less of them. And I have spent a lot of time in wetlands in Southern Ontario for work. So yeah, lots of them out west as well. Okay, we are on to our two frogs. So the first one we have here is the Boreal chorus frog. And if you are tuning in from Ontario and Quebec, just know that there is a different species called the Western chorus frog. It is nearly identical, but here we're going to be focusing on the Boreal chorus frog. If we're in Western Canada, where this is a bit more focused on, this is going to be our only chorus frog. It is a teeny tiny little frog. It's about 2 to 3 centimeters, kind of roughly an inch. It is quite variable in the color of its body and the stripes and spots that it has. But what's consistent between that and the best identifying feature is this dark line that goes from its snout through the eye and down the side of the body. You can see it really nicely in this greenish individual. You can see it here in this more tan one. And it's hard to tell in this, oh, I guess on this brown one over here, that stripe that goes all the way down the side. Otherwise, down its back, there's roughly 3 stripes, which can be fairly broken up. So this green one has 1 stripe here, kind of a broken stripe down the middle, and it'll have another stripe down the side. So there's kind of roughly 3 stripes. This one is very broken. There's a lot of spotting on it, but again, it's kind of in a roughly in 3 lines. The Boreal chorus frog also has really tiny, wimpy back legs, especially compared to the very similar Western chorus frog. It'll have normal-sized back legs, but these ones are reduced enough that it actually hops pretty terribly. And you more often hear this one than you see it. It actually makes quite a loud call, and it sounds like running a fingernail over the teeth of a comb. I'll play that for you. There's a few of them going in this track. So yeah, definitely just sounds like that kind of like running a thumb over the teeth of a comb is really the best description that I can give for that one. I'll play it once more. And you'll hear these guys bright and early, kind of, as soon as melt happens, you will get a lot of amphibians singing right away. So that is the Boreal chorus frog. Another really common frog that we have in the prairie parkland is the wood frog. It's a little bit bigger, 5 to 7 centimeters, so, between 2 and 3 inches-ish. Not quite 3. It is also variable in body color, so that makes it somewhat challenging for some of these amphibian species because they can be so variable. But the difference and the key here is it's got a dark patch behind the eye. So it does have a little bit of a snout stripe, but then it kind of ends in a big wedge right behind the eye, and that doesn't extend into a nice line along the side of the body. Can be a little bit of spotting and flecking depending on the individual, and some individuals can actually have a white stripe down the middle, but I've mostly seen ones that look like this one up in the top left here that don't have that stripe. But that wedge right behind the eye of that kind of dark brownish spot is going to really be helpful for identifying wood frog. And again, these guys are more often heard than they are seen, and the sound is like harsh quacks, or like a waka 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 waka. So I'll play that for you. People often describe it as the frog that sounds like a duck. So it's got a very, very wide distribution. You'll find it pretty much everywhere across Canada. You won't find it in Newfoundland, but otherwise you will mostly be encountering the wood frog if you are out seeing amphibians in wetlands. So just an overview of those two frogs. The Boreal chorus frog is going to have that line extending from the snout, going through the eye, and going through the body. It's more evident on some individuals than the others, but it's also quite tiny. So if you're seeing it in person, it's going to be about an inch. They are not very large frogs, 2 to 3 centimeters. The wood frog, on the other hand, is going to have that wedge behind the eye of that dark spot, and it's going to be pretty small, 5 to 7 centimeters, or roughly 2 and 2 3/4 inches. And again, those sounds, we've got that reek, that that fingernail over the teeth comb for the Boreal chorus frog. Or the harsh cracks and the waka 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 of the wood frog. And despite the name wood frog, they're actually found in a lot of prairie wetlands. They don't necessarily need trees or anything. And you can definitely get wetlands where you have both of these species going at the same time. They're not exclusive that way. Let's go over a couple of our bird sounds from today. That Canada goose honking that everyone is pretty familiar with. You might have heard some red-winged blackbirds in the background if you have your volume up loud enough. That traditional quack, quack, quack of the mallard, but remember, lots of other ducks quack as well, so it's not super diagnostic, especially if you're a beginner. But for the northern shoveler, that suk, 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 suk call is rather diagnostic. We have our red-winged blackbird that does the conqueree, conqueree, and that loud C sound. And our not super musical yellow-headed blackbird with that kind of beep boop wop wop and the snarl song. And last but not least, we have our Sora, the whinny call. As well as our per-weep. And I should mention all of those, words that I'm using to describe, those are usually called mnemonics, M-N-E-N-I-C, mnemonic. And that's just a memory aid. It's a way to describe the sound so that you can hopefully remember it, because it is pretty difficult to put those songs and sounds into words. So thank you very much for attending. This one ran a little bit longer than I intended, but we had a bunch to go through, and I try not to rush these because the idea is to go through this at a relatively slow pace. So if you want to reach out, this is my contact information. The webinar is going to be recorded and uploaded to MarshWatch. There is going to be some quizzes uploaded as well. Hopefully I can get the one for this one finished up by tomorrow and added when I put the link to the video on. If you want to reach out to Birds Canada at all, you can contact us on our website, on all of our socials, and a big thank you to Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund and the Government of Canada for supporting this work. I'm going to shut off the recording now, and we can get to some quizzes and discussions if anybody still has time, but I get it if you need to leave. We are running a little bit over time. Okay, let me stop the recording.